Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Zayin, Daf 7 of Masechta Yevamos. Friends, Daf Zayin is another Gishmak Daf over here. Wait, one second, my chair. What do I do? One second, the chair's uneven. 1 second, give me a second. Alright, I think this will be fine. Anyways, friends, so we're on a mission over here, and we're trying to figure out, sort of the intricacies of Yibum and the arayos that it's not allowed for, right? And we said that essentially they all come, right? We've basically been having the same introduction every single daf, like the last 3 dafs, because we still haven't found a conclusion yet. And that is that basically, of course, going back to the original Mishnah, we said that there are 15 arayos that would not work for Yibum, let's say, right? Meaning, because as we've been saying, the whole concept of Yibum, aside from being strange, is that you have this relationship that is generally prohibited, your brother's wife, and nonetheless, in the context of Yibum, it's allowed. And yet, we have these other 15 arayos which remain prohibited. And we had said that that was because, so it's all learnt out from your wife's sister, which is a relationship which is prohibited. And right, it's your wife's sister is a relationship that's prohibited, and even in the context of Yibum, it's prohibited. And we said that that is learnt out because we have a Gzeira Shaveh, and it says Aleo by Yibum, Yevamos Aleo, and it says Aleo also in the context of sleeping with your wife's sister, to teach us that even in the context of Yibum, you would not do Yibum with your wife's sister. Now, the assumption being that if we would not have that Gzeira Shaveh, then we would assume that Yibum would apply to your wife's sister, and the question is why? So we've been trying to frame it as a situation of aseh docha lo taseh, that Yevamos aleh is a positive commandment. There is a negative commandment not to sleep with your wife's sister, and therefore I would have assumed that the aseh is docha de lo taseh, and therefore, right, and that Yibum would even therefore apply with your wife's sister. Comes the Gzeira Shaveh to say, no, it does not. Now, we've been trying to find a source for why we would assume that aseh is docha lo taseh in this case, and we've been kind of having a hard time. Our latest attempt was to teach it from the context of lo sevaru eish b'chol moshvosechem, in the context of misas bezdin, to assume that aseh would be docha lo taseh, but right, and even in situations where there's karis. But then we ended up saying, no, it's a kal v'chomer, and it has nothing to do with aseh docha lo taseh. So we're still trying to figure out what would be the reason why we would assume that by default, if we wouldn't have the Gzeira Shaveh to teach me that Yibum does not apply to your wife's sister, so we would have assumed that Yibum would otherwise apply to your wife's sister. And the question is, why would we have assumed that? And we're kind of struggling to find that source. Now, Frekti Gemara, we're on Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, about 10 lines into the page. Says the Gemara, okay. Now, if we remember back to the Brisa that we quoted yesterday, in the context of that you don't kindle a flame wherever you live on Shabbos, and we said it's in the context of misas bezdin, that I may have thought that misas bezdin would be docha Shabbos because there's a positive commandment that says v'humas, and he's got to be killed, and it would be docha the negative commandment of l'saisa kol melacha, of do not do melacha on Shabbos. So first we had the havmina to say that aseh would be docha lo taseh, and then for whatever reason we had the havmina to say that wait, maybe you would not do misas bezdin on Shabbos, and then we flipped back and said, wait, maybe actually you would do misas bezdin on Shabbos. So, that which we had initially, entered our mind, which is to say to Asi Esef Dachi Lo Saise, that the positive commandment of Yevamos, of killing this fellow, would override the negative commandment of Lo Saisu Melacha, of don't do melacha on Shabbos. So my o eno dika amar. Well, then what's the flip side, right? Meaning the Brisa kind of started off by saying that I would assume that Misas Bezdin would be Docha Shabbos. Then it flipped to say, wait, maybe though Misas Bezdin is not Docha Shabbos. And then we go back and say, no, Misas Bezdin maybe is Docha Shabbos. What's sort of the thought process here? Right? So we want to say that, well, the first part of it is that we would assume that aseh docha lo taseh, that Yevamos, the positive commandment that we have to kill this fellow, would override the negative commandment of lo saisu kol melacha. Okay, now my o eno de commerce. Now, what was the flip side? What was sort of the pushback to say that maybe Misas Bezdin would not be docha Shabbos? Hachikamer. So this is sort of the opposite argument. Ma ani mekayim. Wait, where am I? Did I skip? That says my o enu dekamer hachikamer. This is what it's saying. Ma ani mekayim chalemos yumos. So then, what do we do with when we say that anybody who does malacha on Shabbos, is mechal Shabbos, has to be killed? Right? Meaning, according to the first way to understand the Brisa, which is that aseh would be doche lo ta'aseh, and therefore you would do Misas Bezdin on Shabbos. So then, what do you do with the pasuk? It says Mechalel mos yumos, that anybody who desecrates the Shabbos is chayiv misa. How can you do Misas Bezdin on Shabbos if it's chilul Shabbos? So b'shar melachos chutz mi Misas Bezdin. So that would be by other melachos, not Misas Bezdin. Misas Bezdin you do on Shabbos, but other melachos, if you do them on Shabbos, you chayiv misa. But Misas Bezdin dochi Shabbos. But Misas Bezdin would be docha Shabbos dasi eseh v'dochi lo saiseh, because we would say that the positive commandment of Yevamos is docha the lo ta'aseh of l'saiseh kol melacha hadar amar, and then the Gemara then counters and says, wait, emar darminon dasi eseh v'dochi lo saiseh greda. But 1 second, I can make the argument that when do we say aseh docha lo ta'aseh? When it's just a plain old lo ta'aseh. Lo ta'aseh sheish bo kares mishamas le'dedachi. But maybe in this case, where we're talking about a mitzvah lo ta'aseh, that you're being mechal Shabbos and you're bechayiv kares, maybe I would not say that aseh is docha lo ta'aseh. Okay, so that's kind of both ways that you can, right? That's the ping pong there, right? That meaning that the havmina was to say that you should do Misas Bezdin on Shabbos because the aseh of Yevamos would override the lo ta'aseh of lo saisu kol melacha. Then the Gemara pushed back and says, wait, but maybe I'll say aseh docha lo ta'aseh just by a regular lo ta'aseh. I don't know, shatnez and tzitzis. Not chayiv kares or anything. But over here on Shabbos, when we're talking about Chilul Shabbos, where you'll be chayiv kares for being mechal Shabbos, maybe I would not say aseh docha lo ta'aseh hadar amar. To which the Gemara says, wait, but maybe I'll say atu eseh doche es lo saseh lavlo saiseh chomer mine. But 1 second, the whole construct of aseh doche lo ta'aseh is that we're saying that this positive commandment, which is not as stringent as the negative commandment, nonetheless overrides the negative commandment. After all, if you violate the negative commandment, we're going to whip you. It's malchus. That's pretty significant. I don't want to get whipped. Do you want to get whipped? No, you don't. And therefore, the whole concept of aseh doche lo ta'aseh is already like a shtickle chiddush. You have this positive commandment that's overriding this negative commandment that's pretty intense in that if you violate this negative commandment, you get whipped. So, and nonetheless, this positive commandment is docha, the negative commandment. And therefore, what's the difference if it's a little bit more stringent or if it's a lot more stringent? The fact that the construct remains, which is that a positive commandment is overriding this negative commandment, which is more stringent than it. So, we started off in this brisa by saying that, well, maybe the aseh of Yevamos is docha the lo ta'aseh of lo saisu kol melacha. Then we said, wait, but maybe I'll say that aseh is docha lo ta'aseh when it's just a regular lo ta'aseh. But in terms of chilul Shabbos, where it's a lo ta'aseh that has kares, maybe I would not say aseh docha lo ta'aseh. To which the Gemara counters and says, no, why should I say that? Why should I say that it depends? That sometimes it depends what the lo ta'aseh is. If it's a regular lo ta'aseh, then we'll say aseh docha lo ta'aseh. But if it's a lo ta'aseh that has kares, then we don't. Why? Based on what? The whole concept of aseh dochelot aseh is that this positive commandment is overriding a negative commandment that has a punishment associated with it. What's the difference if it's a little punishment or a big punishment? The fact of the matter is that the aseh, the mitzvah aseh, is being doche a mitzvah lo taseh, which is more stringent than it. Who cares if it's a lot stringent or a little stringent? So therefore I would argue that aseh is dochelot aseh, even by Chilul Shabbos, even by Misas Bezin on Shabbos. Tamalama lo sevayru, to which the Gemara, the Brisa then says, no, the pasuk says, lo sevayru ish b'chomosh v'seichem, that do not kindle any flames wherever you are, and we said that, we learned out from, it says Moshavos, also by Mitzvahs Bezdin, so therefore, what it's saying is that you don't Mechal Shabbos to like burn, heat up hot lead to pour down a fellow's throat, to kill him. Okay, there you are. Now, Ela Itztrich. Now we get to this Gishmake thing. So, that was very nice. So we just explained the whole Aseh Dochelot Aseh thing in the context of that Brisa. But ultimately that Brisa, right, we had Reb Shimi Bar Ashi who said that, we had Reb Shimi Bar Ashi. Whenever I see Reb Shimi Bar Ashi, the Gemara, I always think of my Chaver Shimi Winter. I haven't seen him in a long time because, Lemaisa, I don't really see anybody. You guys might think I'm joking, but I'm not. No, you probably don't think I'm joking. Akoponim. I saw Hillel Lester on Shabbos. I went for a walk in the afternoon. I think he was a little surprised to see me. Akoponim. It was very nice to see him. Anyways, Akoponim. So, what were we talking? I lost my train of thought. Shimi Winter. I haven't seen him in a long time. Maybe even since I'm back in Eretz Yisrael since June. Yeah. Akoponim. So Shimi Bar Ashi ultimately said that the whole thing by Misas Bezdin is not a question of Aseh Dochelot Aseh, it's a question of Kal V'chomer, right? We may have thought to say that Ritzicha is Doch Avoda, Avoda is Doch Shabbos, therefore Ritzicha should be Doch Shabbos, right? That whole thing was a Kal V'chomer, it's not about Aseh Dochelot Aseh. So therefore, friends, we're still sort of, what's that called? Like grasping for sticks or something? We're picking up sticks, grasping for something. We're trying to figure out why would we assume that short of this Gezerah Shava by Yibum that tells me that you don't do Yibum with your wife's sister, by default I would have assumed that you do. The question is why, and we're struggling to find that source. So says the Gemara, Ela Itzrich, rather I need the Gezerah Shava of Alea in the context of Yibum, because by default, Sakadaite Chamina, I would have said, your friends, you ready for this? It's very gishmak. Tahave Hayeshes Och Dover Shehoyo Bichlal V'yotzim Naklal Lelamed Lo Lelamed Al Atzmo Yotza Ela Lelamed Al Klal Kulo Yotza. Ha ha. Friends, anybody say the paragraph of Rabbi Shmuel Omer in the morning when you're praying? So it's basically the Yud Gimel Midos, the 13 principles that we use to expound the Torah. And if you say that paragraph, so I'm sure that you've said this part, right? And maybe you were wondering, what in the world does that mean? I've never heard of that. How is it actually used? What does it do? What is this construct? Well, on Daf Zayin of Masechta Yevamos, we will explore it. So I may have thought to say, Tabi, Hayeshes Och, the wife of your brother, right? If we take Ruvain, Shimon, Sarah, Rivke, so Ruvain is married to Sarah. So for Shimon, so what's Sarah? Sarah is Shimon's brother Ruvain's wife. Now, Shimon is not allowed to marry Sarah. If Ruvain and Sarah get divorced, Shimon cannot marry Sarah. Yet nonetheless, right, let's read that again. That your brother's wife, in this case Sarah, was something that was included in all of the other arayos, i.e., you're not allowed to sleep with your brother's wife. And it was extracted from the general rule, i.e., when it comes to Yibum, all of a sudden, she's no longer prohibited. All of a sudden, Sarah is no longer prohibited to Shimon. All of a sudden, they're encouraged to do Yibum. Lo lelamed al atzmo yotza. So Sarah's, right, meaning Eishes Och, Sarah's being removed from the rest of the Arayos, to say that now actually you're permitted to Sarah. It's Lo lelamed al atzmo yotza. It doesn't end with just Sarah. Ela lelamed al klal kulo yotza. It teaches about the entire general rule, i.e. all Arayos. And therefore I would have assumed that Yibum does apply to your wife's sister. Because just like it's a chiddush to say that Yibum applies to your brother's wife, i.e. regular Yibum, right? Your brother dies without children, you marry his wife. So, because in the context of Yibum, your brother's wife is waived, I may have thought that actually, one person being waived then goes back and applies to the entire group of all the arayos being waived, and that Yibum, I would have assumed by default, would apply even also to your wife's sister as well. The Tanyas we learn in the Brayso, if you have something that was included in a general rule, v'yotzum min haklal, and it was removed from the general rule, v'chulei, it wasn't only removed to teach about it itself, rather about the entire group. Ketzad, how exactly does this play out, says the Brayso? Here's an example. V'anefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlomim v'tumaso olav, that if a fellow eats shlomim when he's tameh, so he is chayiv kares. Now, there's another pasuk that says, it's not in the Gemara, but it's a pasuk Vayikra Chav Beis Gimel. It says, "Emor aleim l'dorosechem kol isha sheyikav mikol zarachem el hakodshim asher yakdishu b'nei Yisrael Hashem v'tumasu olav v'nichus hanefshem l'fnei Hashem." That anybody who sort of eats any kodshim in a state of tumah, so he's chayiv kares. So we already know from the other pasuk that I just read, the second pasuk, that somebody who eats any kodshim is going to be chayiv kares. So then we have this pasuk that says, "V'nefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlomim v'tumasu olav," that anybody who eats a shlomim in a state of tumah is chayiv kares. V'alo shlomim b'chlal kol hakodshim ayu. 1 second. But we already had a verse that says any kodshim that you eat in a state of tumah, you can be chayiv kares. So mimele, that includes shlomim. So v'loma yatsu. So then how come we're singling out shlomim? What's special about shlomim? We already had the first pasuk. It says any kodshim, if you eat it when you're tummy, you're chayiv kares. So why single out shlomim after that? Just keep quiet, and I already know shlomim from the first pasuk that says any kodshim. So v'lama yatsu, how come we singled out shlomim lahakish alein, to compare to the shlomim, v'lomalach, and to say to you, ma shlomim yuchadim kodshim mizbeach? Well, because just like shlomim is kodshim that goes on the altar, on the mizbeach, af kol kodshim mizbeach, then also when we talk about eating these animals that are kodshim and yuchayiv kares, it's animals that are like shlomim, i.e. that they go on the mizbeach, yotzu kodshim bedek habayis, to the exclusion of bedek habayis. For example, if I donate an animal, a sheep epis, to the Beis HaMikdash so that it can be sold and its money will go towards the temple upkeep. So in that case, it's not a korban, it's not going on the mizbeach. So if I were to eat it, so I would not be chayiv kares. So even though we have the first pasuk that says that anybody who eats kodshim is gonna, and he's tameh, so he's chayiv kares. So then that, it sounds like that would imply, that would apply to all kodshim, including even bedek habayis. If I donate an animal for the bedek habayis and I eat it in a state of tumah, I'd be chayiv kares. So therefore, the pasuk says, no, we have the second pasuk that says, "V'nefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlomim," that specifically chayiv kares if you eat a shlomim in a state of tumah. And we learn from that the rule of that the chiyuv kares for eating kodshim in a state of tumah is only kodshim that are similar to shlomim, i.e. that they go on the mizbeach, to the exclusion of bedek habayis, which does not go on the mizbeach chachanami, and therefore bringing it home to yibum. Havamina eishes och bichlal kol arayos hoysa. I would have thought to say that my brother's wife, in our example, Sarah, was initially Asur to Shimon as his brother Reuven's wife. Vilama Yatzisa, how come it was removed from that group in order to teaching me that all of a sudden Shimon is allowed to be with Sarah via Yibum. So lahakish aleh, and now we should compare to Sarah, compare to your brother's wife. V'lo and to say to you, ma'eshes och sharia, af kol arayos nami sharian, and to say that, well, just like your brother's wife all of a sudden is permitted, so also all the arayos are permitted, including even your wife's sister. And therefore I would assume by default that Yibum would apply to your wife's sister. Therefore I need the Gzeira Shaveh of Alea to teach me that Yibum does not apply to your wife's sister. Oh, friends, friends, what do you have to tell me over here? This is what do you want me to tell you? It really gets your whole being into this daf of Gemara. This daf of Gemara, your whole body is overtaken with the sugya. Let's go weiter. Frag the Gemara mi dami. The Gemara says, hold your horses. Sure, that was very geschmack. Sure, that was very gewaldig. But it's not necessarily accurate. Hasam kla be'isr ufrat be'isr acha kla be'isr ufrat be'heter. Apples and oranges. You cannot compare the davar shahaya b'chlal v'yatzim naklal, etc. of korbanis to what's happening with Yibum, because by korbanis we have two things that are asur. Basically, we're saying that eating kachim, any kachim in a state of tumah is also in your chayav kares. We also say that eating shlamim in a state of tumah is also in your chayav kares. And so both things are asur, but we're trying to understand what is it trying to teach us by singling out shlamim. What it's teaching us is that it goes on the mizbeach, but they're already sort of consistent. They're both things that are asur and that your chayav kares for. That's not the case by arayos and yibum. It's the opposite. What does it mean when we say that your brother's wife was included in all the other arayos? To say that it's asur. You're not allowed to sleep with your brother's wife. And then it's saying v'yatzum and aklal, and it left that group to say that it's mutter. That you're allowed to be with your brother's wife in the context of yibum. So it's not like kodshim, where both, the general kodshim rule and the shlamim are the same thing, i.e., your chayiv kares. Here it's taka the opposite. Initially, your brother's wife was included with the rest of the prohibitions, the rest of the forbidden relationships, and it was then singled out not to continue to say that it's also, but to say that now it's permitted in the context of yibum, which makes it sort of not comparable to the kachim case. So again, midami, are these two cases similar? Also, when it comes to kachim, klal be'isur, ufrat be'isur. The general rule that you're chayiv kares for eating kachim, and the specific rule that you're chayiv kares for eating shlamim, they're both asur. You're both chayiv kares. Hacha klal be'isur. The general rule is in the forbidden, i.e., that you're not that your brother's wife was included with all the other ayos to say that it's asur, ufrat beheter, and then it was singled out to say that it's mutter to sleep with your brother's wife in the context of yibum. So ha lo dami ella. So rather, what the situation by yibum and being all of a sudden permitted to your brother's wife, what that's similar to? The davar shahaya b'chlal, also from Rabbi Shmuel Omer. The davar shahaya b'chlal v'yatzu lidom b'davar achadosh she'ata yachol achzir l'chlalo ad yachzrenu l'cha kasuv b'ferish. Friend, does that ring a bell from Rabbi Shmuel Omer? It's similar. Let's read that again. To something that was included in the general rule, i.e., in our case, your brother's wife. And it was taken out of the general rule. The general rule being that you're not allowed to be with your brother's wife, just like you're not allowed to be with any of the arayos. right, and he was taken out of the general rule, lidon b'davar chadosh, to teach me something new. What is it teaching me that's new? It's teaching me that all of a sudden, there's a big chiddush here. All of a sudden, in the context of Yibum, now you're allowed to be with your brother's wife. That now you can't then go back and apply it back to the rest of the group of arayos, until the Torah specifically tells you that to apply it back to the general rule. I.e., by default, if something is taken out of the general rule and there's something new taught about it, so then it's only for that specific case. You can't apply it back to the rest of the group. And therefore, if we're saying that your brother's wife was included with all the rest of the forbidden relationships that you're not allowed to be with, and then it was taken out, your brother's wife was removed from that group, to say that in the context of Yibum, you're allowed to be with your brother's wife, well then, it ends there. It's limited to your brother's wife, and that's it. Unless the pasuk then tells you that you can now go and apply it back, but if it doesn't, so then it applies only to the exception. In this case, it would apply only to your brother's wife, and that's it. The Tanya is within the if you have something that was initially included in the general rule, and then it was taken out of the general rule in order to teach me something new about this specific case, you cannot then go and apply it back to the rest of the group until the pasuk specifically tells you to apply it to the rest of the group. Ketzad, what's an example of this? In the context of the Asham Mitzorah, that Mitzorah, when he is now tahor, right, after he becomes pure, so he brings korbanis, he brings an Asham, so it says, V'shachat es hakeves, you'll slaughter the Asham Mitzorah, the sheep, Bimkom asher yishchat esachatos, in the place where you slaughter the sin offering, Vesa'ola, and the Ola offering, Bimkom HaKodesh, in the holy part, i.e. in the north of the Azar, Ki kachatos ha'osham hu la'koyin, because the chatos is like the osham. She'ein tam loma kachatos ha'osham. What's pshat with this chatos ha'osham thing? That right, it doesn't need to say that an osham is like a chatas, as Rashi points out. Like what? Meaning, why does it have to go back and say that the osham is like the chatas? In what way? That you slaughter it in the north. It already says that v'shachat esakev is bimkom ashish chatas chatas. So you're going to slaughter the osham mitzorah in the same place where you slaughter the chatas. So when it then goes back and says ki kachatos or osham hu lakoyin, that the osham is like the chatas, what's it teaching us? It says the Gemara, so why does it say that? Why does it say that the Asham is like the Chatos? Well, because initially, the Asham of Mitzorah was just like every other Asham. It's an Asham. What do you want me to tell you? But all of a sudden, we're singling out the Asham of a Mitzorah. And we're teaching something new about it. Lidon b'davar achadosh, to teach me something new, b'boin yadav b'boin rogel, that a mitzorah, when he becomes pure, so we apply blood to the thumb of his hand, the thumb of his foot, hayemonis of the right one. Okay. So the asham of mitzorah was singled out because there's something unique to the Asham of Mitzorah, in that you apply blood to the thumb of his hand, the thumb of his right foot. So now, Frekta Gemara, Yachol lo yeton matan dam ve'emurim legabe mizbeach. Well, is it possible that, now that we've singled out the Asham of the Mitzorah, to single it out from all the other Ashams, to say that the Asham of Mitzorah, you put blood on the fellow's thumbs, well, then I might think that the Asham of Mitzorah is completely unique. Maybe I don't even put any blood, right? Maybe I don't even put any blood or any specified parts on the Mizbeach. Maybe the only thing I do by an Asham Mitzorah is that I put some blood on the fellow's fingers and toes. Right? His right thumb, his right toe, thumb thing, big one. So I might think that that's it. That's the only thing that you do with an asham. You don't actually put any blood on the mizbeach. You don't put any parts of the animal on the mizbeach. Therefore it says, no, the asham is like a chatos. Ma chatos tu'unama and domim ve'emurim legabi mizbeach. Just like by korban chatos, blood and parts of the animal go on the mizbeach. Af asham ton ma and domim ve'emurim legabi mizbeach. Also the asham, it does have blood and parts of the animal that go on the mizbeach. Ve'ilo ahadre kra, and if the pasuk didn't specifically go back and tell me to put the blood and the parts of the animal on the mizbeach, hava amina, I may have thought l'may de nafak nafak, l'may de lo nafak lo nafak, that which it was taken out and described about specifically, only that applies, and whatever wasn't mentioned doesn't apply. Right? Meaning the Havamina was that the Asham Mitzorah was initially just like every other Asham, but then it was taken out of the category and specified that you put the blood on the person's fingers and feet. So then I might think that, well, that's the only thing you do with the Asham. To which the Pasuk therefore had to then say, wait, Kikachata so Asham ula Hashem, wait, no, this Asham, sure, there's something unique, which is the blood on the fingers and feet, but it's also like a chatas in that the blood still goes on the mizbeach, the parts of the animal go on the mizbeach, but we only know that because the pasuk had to go back and tell us that. Hachanami, and therefore here also, when it comes to your brother's wife, that she initially was included with the rest of the arayos, i.e. that they would be also, right, that Sarah would be also to Shimon, but now your brother's wife was singled out to teach something new, which is that in the context of Yibum, all of a sudden Shimon and Sarah, are able to be together and do Yibum. So Havamina Eshes Och the Ishtira Shaya Rayos Lo. Therefore, I'll say here as well that what's singled out is what's permitted, but that's it. I.e., only your brother's wife, right? Ruvain died. Now Sarah is permitted to Shimon, but that's it. If there was also, if Sarah, if Shimon, however, was married to Rivka, who was Sarah's sister, which means that by marrying Sarah, he's also marrying his wife's sister, that would not be allowed, because only marrying your brother's wife is what's allowed. Marrying your sister, your wife's sister, would not be allowed. And therefore, we're kind of back to square one again. Well, then why are we assuming that by default, you would do Yibum with your wife's sister, right? We had just said, right, the last thing that we just said was, let's say this. We had initially tried to say that it's a, Davar Shahoy B'chlav V'yotzim Kal L'lamed Lo L'lamed Al Atzmi Yotza Ela L'lamed Al Klal Kulo Yotza. Initially wanted to say, well, maybe just like you can do Yibum with your brother's wife, maybe you can do Yibum with any of the arayos, to which we said, no, it's not like that. Rather, it's Davar Shahoy B'chlav V'yotzim Lidom Davar Achadosh that no, rather it's similar to a situation where you had something included which was then taken out to teach something new. It's limited to that thing only, unless the pasuk specifically tells you to bring it back, but the pasuk didn't specifically say that in this case, and therefore we'll say that Yibum only applies to your brother's wife. Yibum does not apply to your wife's sister. Wow. Woo. It's like a workout. I don't exercise or anything, but I learned Daf Zayin and Masechta Yevamos. Maybe it counts for something. So, back to square one. Why would we assume that I would do Yibum with my wife's sister? Rather, it enters your mind to say, Teisi b'memotzinu mi'eishesach. The Gemara says, well, look, if we spend like 3 daf already trying to figure this out and we haven't found the solution, well, let me just try this. Because, but Memotzino, they'll say, look, well, since we haven't succeeded in sort of more empirical ways, well, let's just try to make the argument of, well, I don't know, if I do yibum with my brother's wife, so I don't know, I'll also do yibum even if she happens to be my wife's sister as well. I don't know, just like it works with my brother's wife, so also it works with my wife's sister. Okay. But then the Gemara immediately says, what? But me dummy? Those two cases aren't similar. You can't just say that. You can't just say because. You can't just say that, well, I don't know, Yibum works with my brother's sister, with my brother's wife, and that's something that isn't usually allowed. So then, I don't know, let's just say that it also works with my wife's sister, which usually isn't allowed. But those aren't similar. They're different because your brother's wife is only one thing that is asur and becoming permitted, i.e. that you're not allowed to marry your brother's wife, but now in the context of Yibum, you are. But when your brother's wife is also your wife's sister, right? If Reuven and Shimon are brothers, and Sarah and Rivka are sisters, and Reuven is married to Sarah, and Shimon is married to Rivka, and then Reuven dies without children, so when Shimon marries Sarah, he's marrying his brother's wife, sure, but he's also marrying his wife's sister. That's two sort of problems. So therefore, even though Eina Chinami, yes, Yibum dictates that you can marry your brother's wife, but I wouldn't necessarily assume that you can marry your brother's wife when she's also your wife's sister. Ho. Ma'u detema. So the Gemara says, but I may have thought to say ho ishtri. Says the Gemara, yeah, but I may have thought to say that once it's permitted, it's permitted. Kilu, one, enochinami, 1, 2, who cares? The point is that there was a situation where that was not allowed, and now it is allowed. Does it matter if we're talking about one thing that wasn't allowed or two things that wasn't allowed? I may have thought that once, I'm not allowed to be with my brother's wife. All of a sudden, in the context of Yibum, I am. So I may have thought that once Yibum comes to say that these forbidden relationships are all of a sudden permitted, I might think to say it's permitted whether it's just my brother's wife or whether it's my brother's wife who happens to also be my wife's sister. Yibum comes to say that it's all allowed. And how do we know this concept of once it's permitted, it's permitted? The Tanya, as we learn in the Brayso Mitzorah, shechoshmini shelo be'erev Pesach, givaldik. So you have a fellow, he's a Mitzorah, and now the 8th day of his purification process, the day that he brings the korbanos, he's a mechutzer kippurim that day, right? On day 7, he shaved his head, went to the mikvah, all that kind of stuff. He was a tful yom until that night. Comes day 8, that's the day that he's got to bring his korbanos. And he's a mechusar kippurim. He brings his korbanos that day, and then he brings his asher mitzorah. He puts the blood on his hands and his fingers and all that kind of stuff, and his feet. And then that night he can eat the korban pesach with everybody else. So mitzorah choshmini shelo be'erev pesach, a mitzorah that day 8, the day that he brings his korbanos, falls out on erev pesach. But guess what happens? V'rakeri bo bayom. But he also saw Keri. He also saw Keri that day. Now, a Bal Keri is not allowed to go into the Har HaBayis. Right? We learned these Gemaras in Masechta Pesachim. Right? Of course, there's Machne Shechina, Machne Levia, Machne Yisrael. So the Azara is Machne Shechina. Outside of the Azara is Machne Levia. Outside of Har HaBayis, right, meaning Har HaBayis is Machne Levia. Outside of Har HaBayis is Machne Yisrael. Now, Tumas Meis, Tumas Sheretz, Tumas Nevela, these Tumas are allowed in the Har HaBayis, they're just not allowed in the Azara. Tumas Zov, Tumas Mitzorah, Tumas Balkeri are not even allowed on Har HaBayis either. Mitzorah has to be thrown out of all 3 machnos, but a Zov and a Balkeri are not allowed on Har HaBayis. And therefore, so this Mitzorah, so he's no longer a Mitzorah, right? Day 7, he became pure, he went to the mikveh, he was a Tvul Yom for the rest of the day. It's now the next day, he's allowed on Har HaBayis, he's a Mechutz Kippurim, he's not allowed into the Azara, but he's allowed on Har HaBayis. But then he sees Keri. And a Baal Keri is not allowed on Har HaBayis. So V'toval, if he goes to the mikveh that day, on day 8, so he's a Baal Keri, went to the mikveh, he's still a Tvul Yom for that day. And a Tvul Yom for Keri would not be allowed to go onto Har HaBayis. So Amru, the Chacham said, Apapisha in Tvul Yom Acher Nichnos, even though in general we would say that a Tvul Yom, a Baal Keri Tvul Yom would not go on Har HaBayis. Nonetheless, Zen Nichnos. In this particular case, the Tvul Yom of a Baal Keri, who's also a Mitzorah, who's a Mechusar Kippurim, would be allowed on Har HaBayis so that he can go and get the blood on his hands and his feet so that night he can eat the Korban Pesach. Mutav Shiavu Esei Sheyesh Bo Karis, because better that the mitzvah's Esei that has Karis associated with it, i.e. Korban Pesach, right? It's a positive commandment to offer the Korban Pesach, and if you don't offer the Korban Pesach, you chayav Karis. So if that should come, v'yitcha esei she'ein bo karis, and that should override the essay that doesn't have karis associated with it, i.e. v'shalchu min ha'machne. Right? It says v'shalchu min ha'machne kol tzaro v'chol zav v'chol something. So, so the positive commandment to throw these people out of what is ultimately machne leviyah, i.e. to say that a Baal Keri and a Tvul Yom of a Baal Keri is not allowed on Har HaBayis. So that's an asay that does not have a chiyuv kares associated with it. So the asay of Korban Pesach, which has a chiyuv kares, right, i.e. that we want this person to be able to eat the Korban Pesach that night, this Mitzorah who just needs to go, he goes into Har HaBayis and he stands in Shar Nikanor, which does not have Kedushas Azara, and he sticks his hands into the Azara and they then put blood on his hands and feet, then he can eat the Korban Pesach that night, but he needs to go to Shar Nikanor, and he has to go on Har HaBayis, of course, to get to Shar Nikanor, and he can't go if he's a Baal Keri, even if he's a Tvul Yom of Baal Keri, he can't go on Har HaBayis. So he said, yes, but let's say that the mitzvah's asay of Korban Pesach, which has karis associated with it if you don't offer it, should override the mitzvah saseh v'shalchu min ha'machne to throw away the Baal Keri out of the camp. So, and we're going to say that because we're going to give precedence to the Korban Pesach, he's allowed to go on Har HaBayis, to go to Shar Nikanor, so that they can put blood on his hands and feet, and then that night he'll be able to eat the Korban Pesach. Vam Rabbi Yochanan, it says Rabbi Yochanan, Dvar Torah afilu esei leizbei. And says Rabbi Yochanan that even midoraisa, the fact of the matter is that a Baal Keri being sent away from the Har HaBayis is not even a mitzvah saseh of vishalch min hamachne. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Vayamud Yoshafat b'kal Yehuda, that Yoshafat stood among the people of Judah, the congregation of Judah, lifnei achatzar achadasha, before the new courtyard. My chatzar achadasha, what's the new courtyard? Amar Rabbi Yochanan shechidshu badvarim, that they made a chiddush v'amru Tvul Yom lo yikanis machne leviyah, and they said that a Tvul Yom cannot go into the machne leviyah, the camp of the Levites, i.e. Har HaBayis. So Rabbi Yochanan wants to argue that it's even that a Baal Keri not going to Har HaBayis is even just a din d'Rabbanan, even it's not even midoraisa. Okay, fine. So very good. So givaldig. So what are we saying? So we're saying that this guy who was a Mitzorah, and now it's day 8, and it's the day that he's got to bring his korbanos. So we say that he comes into Har HaBayis and as a Mechusar Kippurim, and he sticks his hand, he goes to Shar Nikanor and he sticks his hands to the Azar, and they put blood on his hands and his feet. But he ends up being a Baal Keri. Now Baal Keri in general can't go into Har HaBayis, and that would preclude him from being able to go to Shar Nikanor. But we say, let's waive the Baal Keri-ness. Okay, fine. So essentially what do you have? You have this guy, he's a Mechusar Kippurim, and he's a Baal Keri. Alright, so now we're already getting somewhere, right? I.e. that reminiscent of Ruvain and Shimon and Sarah and Rivka, i.e., Sarah is both Shimon's brother's wife and also his wife's sister. So now, coming back to our case of Mitzorah. So you have this guy, it's Erev Pesach, it's day 8 of his purification process. He's a Mechusar Kippurim, but he's also a Tvul Yom of a Balkari. So, that's 2 reasons to say that he would not be allowed to go into the Azara. So let's go weiter for a second. V'amar Ula, Matam, Hov Hutu L'Tzaraito, Hutu L'Keruyo. Okay. So now, one thing that's important to understand about the opinion of Ula is that Ula holds that Bia b'mitzvah shma bia, that even if part of your body goes into the Azara, so then it's considered like your whole body went to the Azara. And therefore, this Balkari, even if he's allowed on Harabayas, he's not allowed into the Azara. And if he goes into the Azara, I think he's Chayiv Kares. Like, you're not allowed to do that. And says Ula's opinion, so, okay, now going back to the Mitzorah, what does the Mitzorah do? So the Mitzorah, on day 8 of his purification process, he brings a Korban Asham, an Asham Mitzorah, and then he goes to Shar Nikanor, which does not have the holiness of the Azara, but then he goes to Shar Nikanor and he sticks his hands into the Azara, and the Kohen then applies blood to his hands and to his feet. Now, according to Ula, partially sticking your body into the Azara is as if you stuck your whole body into the Azara and you're Chayiv Kares. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that obviously a Mitzorah, who's a Mechusar Kippurim on day 8, and a Mechusar Kippurim is not allowed to go into the Azara, he's going to be Chayiv Kares. And Ula's opinion in general is that even if you partially go into the Azara, it's like you entirely went into the Azara. But in the context of Mitzorah, who's a Mechusar Kippurim, that's like, by definition, Mitzorah on day 8, when he's bringing his korbanos, right, before he's done bringing his korbanos, he's a Mechusar Kippurim. Nonetheless, he's allowed to stick his hand into the Azara. So the Torah says that. The Torah says that in Mitzorah, on day 8, when he's a Mechusar Kippurim, he's allowed to stick his hands into the Azara so that you could put blood on his hands and feet. Now, Ula is saying that this guy who is a Mitzorah, and it's day 8, and then he becomes a Balkari, so according to Ula, fine, granted that the Mitzorah is allowed to stick his hands into the Azara, because the Torah says he's allowed to, but what about the fact that he's a Balkari? A Balkari who sticks his hands into the Azara is going to be Chayiv Kares. And the Torah never says that a Balkari is allowed to stick his hands into the Azara, that a Balkari is allowed to go into the Azara. So therefore, even though granted that he's allowed to stick his hands into the Azara based on the fact that he's a Mitzorah on the 8th day of his purification process, but what about the fact that he's a Balkari? Why is he allowed to stick his hands into the Azara as a Balkari? So you know what Ula says? But since he's allowed to stick his hands into the Azara as part of the purification process for Mitzorah, and even though a Mechusar Kippurim is not allowed to stick his hands into the Azara according to Ula, because Bia b'mitzvah shma bia, that even partially putting your hands into the Azara, it's like you put your entire body into the Azara. So even though in general you would not be allowed to stick your hands into the Azara as a Mechusar Kippurim, but since it's allowed in the context of the fact that he's a Mitzorah on the 8th day of his purification process, well then it's also then allowed and waived in the context of the fact that he's also a Balkari. That since it was permitted for the Mitzorah, then we're also going to apply it and say that it's permitted for the fact that he's a Balkari as well. The entire thing is permitted, and therefore, I would think to say that since Yibum is permitted by your brother's wife, right, even though in general you would not be allowed to marry your brother's wife, but Yibum is permitted for your brother's wife, well then it's also going to be permitted even if your brother's wife happens to also be your wife's sister. Because since it's permitted for one, it's permitted for the other as well. And therefore, I would think that you would do Yibum even if your brother's wife is also your wife's sister. And that's why we need the Gzeir Shava of Aleho. But now the Gemara says, Midami Lid'ula? Oh my gosh, this stuff is a workout. So now the Gemara says, 1 second. Are these cases really comparable? Would Ula really say, meaning Ula says that sure, when you have this fellow who's a Mitzorah on day 8, he's Mechusar Kippurim, and he's also Balkari, so since it's permitted for the Mitzorah, it's also permitted for the Balkari, fine. But would he say that since I'm allowed to do Yibum with my brother's wife, I'm also allowed to do Yibum with my brother's wife when she's also my wife's sister? So granted that maybe in a situation where Ruvain first married Sarah, and then afterwards Shimon married Rivka, who's Sarah's sister, meaning that from the time that Ruvain married Sarah, already Shimon was also to Sarah as being his brother's wife. And then when Shimon goes and marries Rivka, Sarah's sister, Sarah, in addition to being Ruvain's brother's wife, is additionally now, in addition to being Shimon's brother Ruvain's wife, she is additionally now Shimon's wife Rivka's sister. So first there was the thing that wasn't allowed, which was achos ach, right? That Sarah is the wife of Shimon's brother Ruvain. And then when Shimon marries Rivka, additionally Sarah becomes asur to Shimon because she's also now Shimon's wife Rivka's sister. So Teinachecha Denasa Meis. So granted in a situation where first Ruvain, who ultimately dies, that's why he's the Meis, that Ruvain marries Sarah first, which makes Sarah asur to Shimon first by being his brother Ruvain's wife. And then afterwards Shimon marries, meaning Shimon, the guy who's going to stay alive, the brother who stays alive, marries Rivka. That first came the Isser of Eshes Ach, and then afterwards came, right, which ultimately then becomes permitted in the context of Yibum, and then afterwards came the Isser of Achos Isha. Demigo de Ishtri Isser Eshes Ach, that since, I can argue that in line with Ula, that since the first thing becomes permitted, i.e. his brother's wife becomes permitted through Yibum, so then Ishtri Nami Isser Achos Isha. Then also, once already your brother's wife becomes permitted to you, well then the second thing as well becomes permitted, i.e. your wife's sister. But Elanosa Chai, but what about in a situation where Shimon first marries Rivka, V'acharkach Nosa Meis, and only afterwards does Ruvain marry Sarah, i.e. the first Isser that came around was that Sarah was asur to Shimon on account of being the sister of Shimon's wife Rivka. That came first. And only afterwards, when Ruvain then marries Sarah, does Sarah become asur to Shimon, also because of the fact that she's now Shimon's brother Ruvain's wife. So the first thing that came along was that Sarah was the sister of Shimon's wife Rivka, and then only secondly did she become asur to Shimon on the account that also she is the wife of Shimon's brother Ruvain. So again, Elanosa Chai, but if Shimon first marries Rivka, v'achakach nosa meis, and then only afterwards Ruvain marries Sarah, Isser Achos Isha Kodim. So the Isser, right, of Sarah being the sister of Shimon's wife Rivka came first. V'afilu nosa, period, right? So that came first. In which case, when Ruvain dies, and therefore in the context of Yibum, the fact that Sarah is Shimon's brother Ruvain's wife, maybe that becomes okay in the context of Yibum, but the first thing that came along remains, which is that Sarah was first the sister of Shimon's wife Rivka, and that remains, and therefore that should remain asur, and Shimon should not be allowed to do Yibum with Sarah. Va'afilu nasa meis nami, and even in the first example, when Reuven got married first, that Reuven married Sarah, and Shimon only afterwards marries Rivka. So, i.e., that the Isser of Achos of Eshes Ach came before Achos Isha. But Nami still, Tenachecha denosa meis vameis. Granted, fine, maybe in a situation where Reuven first married Sarah, and then Reuven died. And by Reuven dying, Sarah now, who was the wife of Shimon's brother Reuven, now becomes permitted to Shimon because Reuven is dead. And then, after she's already permitted to Shimon, Shimon then marries Rivka, who's Sarah's sister, making Sarah now the sister of Shimon's wife, Rivka. And then afterwards Shimon marries Rivka. That at least at least at the time that Shimon married Rivka, he was already permitted to Sarah because Reuven was already dead. But in the situation where Reuven marries Sarah, and then while he's still alive, and then afterwards Shimon marries Rivka while Reuven was still alive and Sarah was still asur to Shimon, lo ichazya le klal. Sarah was never permitted to Shimon. And continues the Gemara, Modi Ula, wouldn't Ula admit that going back to the case of the Mitzorah and the Balkari, She'imra Kari Bilel Shmini, that if this fellow would have seen Kari the night before, meaning in the example that we gave, was that on the 8th day, this fellow saw Kari, i.e., at a time when he was already permitted, right? On day 7 he goes to the mikveh, that night he's already permitted, he just has to bring his korbanos. And then before he had a chance to bring his korbanos, he saw Kari. But at least the Mitzorah was over at that point. But Ula would say that if he saw Kari the night before, when the Mitzorah was not yet over, She'ein machnis yodav lebahonos, in that case he would not put his hands into the Azar. If at the time that he saw Kari, he wasn't yet done being a Mitzorah, he wasn't yet up to day 8 of being a Mitzorah, of the purification of the Mitzorah. Because if he sees Kari that night, the night before the 8th day, well then he never had any point where he was able to bring the korban. It wasn't yet the 8th day, and he already saw Kari, so then it would not be allowed. Only in a situation where he saw Kari on the 8th day, where he was already able to bring his korban, and he was no longer a Mitzorah, he was kind of out of that parsha, then he becomes a Bal Kari. That's when we say that he could still stick his hands into Azara. But if he never had any period where he was allowed, where he was able to bring his korbanos, then he would not be able to stick his hands to the Azara. And therefore, even in the situation of where Reuven marries Sarah before Shimon marries Rivka, still, if at the time that Shimon marries Rivka, Reuven is still allowed and Sarah is still asur to Shimon, so then even when Reuven dies, we wouldn't say that he'd be permitted to marry Sarah. So therefore, we can't just simply apply the case of Hov Ishtri, that since it's permitted, it's permitted. I mean, even when Ula says once it's permitted, it's permitted, he only says that when the Kari was seen on day 8, when he was already able to bring his korbanos. So interestingly, the Gemara says, okay, you know what? When do we need Aleh? When do we need the Gezerah Shava? All of a sudden it's limited. All of a sudden the Gemara says, yeah, you know when we need the Gezerah Shava? We need the Gezerah Shava to teach me that it's asur for Shimon to do Yibum with Sarah if she is the sister of his wife Rivka, only in a situation where Reuven married Sarah and then Ruvain dies, which makes Sarah permitted to Shimon, and only at that point, once Shimon was already permitted to Sarah, does he then marry Rivka. I might think, right, making Sarah the sister of his wife Rivka, I might think to say, like Ula says by the Metzora and the Balkari, that since Shimon is allowed to marry Sarah, because Reuven's already dead at the time that he married Rivka, I might think that just like we waive the Achos Ach, the fact that, the Eshes Ach, the fact that Sarah was the wife of his brother Reuven, I would think that we would also waive the fact that Sarah is the sister of his wife Rivka, to which we need the Gezer Shava of Aleha to say, don't say that. So now all of a sudden this Gezer Shava is limited to a situation where Reuven married Sarah and then died, and only afterwards did Shimon marry Rivka, that at the time that Sarah became the sister of his wife, she was already permitted him because Reuven had already died. Friends, that's what you call Daf 7 of Masechta Yevamos. Wow. Woo. Oh. Wow. Oof. Okay, friends, what are we talking about in Daf 7? Talk about a whole bunch of geschmacka things. I'm like hoarse after this daf. It's it really required all of my energies on this daf. Akoponim. So yesterday at the end of the daf, we had tried to bring a proof from Lo Savar Eish B'Chomosh V'Seichem, but then we said forget about it. It's not about Lo Saseh and Aseh Doch Lo Saseh. Rather, it's a Kal V'Chomer. Forget it. You can't learn from there. So we tried to say that maybe it's Davar Shahaya B'Chlal V'Yotza Min HaKlal L'Lamed. That maybe we could say, well, initially your brother's wife was also to you, like all the other arayos, but then it leaves that general rule to say that you're allowed to marry her in the context of Yibum. So maybe I would think to say that maybe all of the arayos are permitted in the context of Yibum. And therefore I need the Gezer Shava of Aleh to say, no, you're not allowed to marry, you're not allowed to do Yibum if it's your wife's sister. To which the Gemara says, yeah, but it's not a situation of Davar Shahaya B'Chlal V'Yotza Min HaKlal L'Lamed. Rather, it's Davar Shahaya B'Chlal V'Yotza Lido Medavar Achadosh. Rather, it's something that was initially included with the rest of the rayos to say that it's Asur, but it was removed from that category to say something new, which is that in the context of Yibum, Taka, your brother's wife is now allowed. It can only teach us specifically about that case. It doesn't teach us about all the other cases, and therefore we have no reason to assume that your wife's sister would be permitted in the context of Yibum. Then we tried to kind of say that, wait, well, maybe let's just simply argue, well, since your brother's wife is permitted, then maybe your wife's sister is also permitted, as simple as that. Then we say, but what do you mean? We don't just say, hov ishtri, right? Or, when do we say that? So basically, what we ended up saying is, well, we have this opinion of Ula, that you can say hov ishtri, in a situation of a Mitzora on day 8, that who becomes a Balkari, that even though a Balkari is Chayiv Kares for sticking his hands into Azara, but since he's allowed to stick his hands into the Azara as a Mitzora on day 8, so he's also allowed to stick his hands into the Azara even though he became a Balkari that day as well. An interesting thing to point out is that specifically because he saw Keri on day 8, i.e., that at the time that he saw Keri, he was already able to bring his korbanos, he was already out of the parsha of Mitzora. Which means that if we want to apply it to our case, it would be a situation where Reuven married Sarah and then died, which means that Sarah is now permitted to Shimon, and then at that time when Sarah was already permitted to Shimon, Shimon then married Sarah's sister Rivka, which then makes her Sarah the sister of his wife Rivka. We'll say in that case, I would think to say in that case, well, since he was already permitted to Sarah, he should already be permitted to Sarah even when she is Rivka's sister, his wife's sister. Therefore, we need the Gzer Shava to say, no, do not say that. Rather, you would not be allowed to marry, Shimon would not be allowed to marry Sarah if she is his wife Rivka's sister. Friends, peace.